Hello and welcome to The World at One with me, Sarah Montague. The Supreme Court rules that trans women are not legally women.
All women's rights are human rights.
The trans community take a different view.
This is like a physical punch, because what it feels like is that you'd like to exclude us wholesale from UK society.
What is a woman? The question of whether that word encompasses trans women, as well as those born biologically female, has dogged politicians and policymaking for years. Now we have the judgment of the Supreme Court. In a unanimous ruling, they say the definition of a woman relates to a biological woman and biological sex. The gender-critical campaigning group who brought the case, For Women Scotland, celebrated outside the court. In his ruling, Supreme Court Judge Lord Hodge laid out the two competing philosophies at the heart of the case.
On the one hand, women, who make up one half of our population, have campaigned for over 150 years to have equality with men and to combat discrimination based on their sex. That work still continues. On the other hand, a vulnerable and often harassed minority, the trans community, struggle against discrimination and prejudice as they seek to live their lives with dignity.
And then he delivered his ruling with an added reassurance that the rights of trans people will not be affected.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and harassment in substance in their acquired gender.
Now, the ramifications of this will affect organisations across the UK, but the case started when the Scottish Government said that female quotas on Scottish boards could include trans women. Scotland's First Minister has said the Scottish Government accepts the ruling and added that protecting the rights of all will reform its response. James Cook is our Scotland editor and is outside court. And James, it is truly a landmark ruling. It has been a long time working its way through the courts, hasn't it?
Yes, this has been a 5-year-long legal battle for those who brought this case. And as you say, it went backwards and forwards in the Scottish courts before ultimately ending up here. And when Lord Hodge uttered the words that you've just played there, Sarah, the unanimous decision is that the terms woman and sex refer to a biological woman and biological sex. There were gasps of relief, really, and also, I think, delight from those who had brought the case. And then after the judges left the bench, there was a much greater wave of emotion, with campaigners hugging each other, punching the air, several in tears, including Susan Smith of For Women Scotland, who said to me in seconds after the judgment that they felt that they had got a ruling now which reflected everything they'd always been saying.
Right. It does. I mean, I mentioned how it started, but its effects could be very widely felt.
Yeah, and to pick up your point on where it started with that law that you mentioned, passed by the Scottish Parliament in 2018, which aimed to ensure gender balance on public boards. And the result of this ruling, the direct and immediate result, is that law will not include trans women. They will not be defined as women for the purposes of that law. But as you say, and as you mentioned in terms of referencing the First Minister John Swinney's position, this won't just apply to that by any stretch of the imagination. Throughout England, Scotland and Wales, where the Equality Act's writ runs, there will now be conversations among numerous public bodies, local authorities and so on about how to respond to this and to what extent they need to protect single-sex spaces. And obviously, although we heard from Lord Hodge there on behalf of the judges saying that this does not undermine the rights of trans people, there are many trans people and campaigners for trans rights who are extremely concerned about the potential implications of what's going to happen now.
James, thank you very much, and we are going to be diving into that in just a moment. But first, James mentioned Susan Smith there. She is one of the campaigners for Women's Scotland who brought that legal challenge to the Supreme Court. And she joins us now. Good afternoon.
Hello.
How do you feel? How did you feel when you heard that judgment?
Oh, it was incredible relief and joy. We had no indication going into the Supreme Court what the ruling was going to be. So I don't remember feeling quite so nervous in a very, very long time.
But do you feel now that you have got everything you want?
Yes. Essentially, what we really wanted was clarity in the law, and we wanted to know when something is described as a single-sex service or a single-sex space, it's unequivocal that it means relates to biology, and that women will have the assurance going forward of knowing that if a service is advertised as being for women, there is no possibility of them encountering anyone in there who's born male.
Okay. What difference is that going to make on the ground? When you think of a single-sex space, what do you think of?
Well, exactly what it says, that it's somewhere that is only available to members of one or the other sex, and there are only the two sexes. And I think that up until now, many organisations have been pushing out a false narrative. I mean, I believe this has always been the law. I don't believe anything's changed. But unfortunately, a lot of people have been wildly misinformed about what the law is. And they have started to operate on a basis of self-identification.
Right, which actually very few trans people do have a gender recognition certificate. So
yes,
often arguably it is self-identification. But can I ask just, so if you came across somebody that you thought was biologically male in a public toilet, would you say something?
I think most women wouldn't actually, and I don't think I would. I think most of the time we're conditioned to be wary of people who are male, but I think it will give women the reassurance of knowing that, say they were at the gym and they were getting changed and there is someone who is obviously male in there, they will be able to go out to the front desk and say there is somebody who is a man in the women's changing room, and not face accusations of bigotry and transphobia.
I mean, there are going to be difficulties thrown up by this. You consider trans men who may look very masculine, who presumably under this would be required to, if we're referring to public toilets, go to a female toilet, who then could be...
Think... Oh, sorry.
I'm just wondering about how it'll work.
I don't think there's a requirement particularly. You know, most law, most policy operates on a sort of civic contract. We expect people to obey rules. And I can't really answer for whether or not men will have a problem with that. But we do expect people to adhere to rules, and we do expect that if a problem is raised, it can be sorted out. And I think one thing that keeps being missed in this conversation was that we were aware that that cohort, natal females who identified as men, actually stood to lose rights if we'd have lost, because they wouldn't have been classed as women anymore, and they would have lost, for example, maternity rights and equal pay rights.
Right. Susan Smith, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, the government has given a response to the ruling. This was the Treasury Minister, James Murray, this morning.
I think what it does do is give clarity to women and service providers. And obviously, more widely, single-sex spaces are protected in the law, and they will remain protected under this government.
Jane Fay is a trans writer and director of the advocacy group Transactual UK. I asked for her reaction to the ruling.
I would say both as an individual, but also as part of a community, we are devastated. I've been talking to people in tears. My own reaction was I had breakfast and I simply brought it back up. This is like a physical punch, because what it feels like for pretty much every trans non-binary person in the UK is that you'd like to exclude us wholesale from UK society. So today we're feeling very alone, but I don't want to end it there, because we have come through worse before. We have come through, we have survived, we will survive this, and we will be back stronger than before. I think that's important to understand.
You're obviously incredibly disappointed. What effect will it have on trans people? And I'm mindful of the fact that the judge said that it does not affect the rights of trans people as they are protected.
Yes, this is the thing. And I think the problem is that this judgment actually opens up a can of worms without actually identifying the name or species of the worm. It's all very well saying that there is a thing called biological sex, but they've not defined it. And that's going to come back and haunt some people, because, as you may or may not be aware, the reason the International Olympic Committee stopped doing chromosome testing was so many non-trans, so many cis women turned out not to be cis women. It turned out they were some variant of intersex in the end. Our concern is with rights, because forget about the highfalutin legal stuff. What does this mean? Can I use this loo? Can I do that? Can I do the other? And if it is simply a ruling that women's spaces are defined in law and they're already exempted, then this is actually a bit of a nothing burger, as I think the American expression is. If it's sort of any space that you might associate with women can now be used to exclude trans women from, then that's a big one, because it means that we can't partake in society. It also creates a very peculiar double bind for trans guys, because in the first instance, you're going to see some very mustachioed, balding, whiskered trans men in women's loos if you go down that road. And I wonder how people like that. And second, it's possible that trans men could be double excluded, so not allowed in women's spaces as trans men, but not allowed in trans spaces as women. It's very confusing.
Are there some areas that you would say it's going to apply to refuges, perhaps to prisons, perhaps to hospital wards? Do you know where it would definitely apply to?
No, and that's the key thing. So if it's those places that have applied for an exemption are perfectly entitled to, well, it's nothing. If it's anyone and their dog can just declare a space a woman's space and you can't go in. But the point is, if you look at a pub, historically it's up to the landlord as to who goes where. Once the Equality Act was passed, that meant a landlord couldn't exclude you from the women's loos if you were a trans woman. Well, has that changed? Because if they're upholding the Equality Act, it sounds like it hasn't changed. So I think where we're sat this morning is it could mean a lot. It could mean very little.
Jane Fay. Alison Holtz, the BBC's social affairs editor, and is here with me in the studio. So, Alison, we have what is a very clear ruling, isn't it? Trans women are not legally women.
Yeah, the thing it's brought to us is clarity in terms of the Equality Act. So I think that's the important thing to say. It's the interpretation of the 2010 Equality Act, but inevitably the legal status of trans women is more complex than that. We've got gender recognition certificates, which give those who have them, the right to be treated in as the gender they have acquired in most circumstances. So there's an awful lot of questions, I think, from Jane. You'll certainly have got that sense, but there are a lot of questions which are still to be answered about how this will work practically, which bit of legislation has effect on which bit of public life. But the fundamental is that the Equality Act is now much clearer. We know that biological sex, or we know that sex means biological sex in its terms.
Okay, what is your understanding at this stage of how that will apply in different, well, what I'm going to say women's spaces, but I guess that could cover everything from a public loo to a refuge?
Interesting, they don't mention toilets in the judgment, but they do talk about single-sex spaces, for instance, changing rooms and hostels for women who have faced domestic abuse. The implication of it seems to be that they will be for women of a particular, they will be for biological women. But the responses from both the Scottish Government and the UK and the Westminster Government have very much been, we need to sit down and work out what this means. That whilst it brings clarity, it's now about how is that applied on a day-to-day basis in different places.
Okay, and so, I mean, we end up with where it means an awful lot or where it means an awful little? I mean, is that the potential still, or is it undoubtedly going to mean changes?
I think whatever, it means a huge amount to both groups who have been involved in this action, both the For Women Scotland and their supporters, and trans people and their supporters. So it means a huge amount for those groups and how they feel about life. I think the jury is still out on the practical day-to-day differences it's going to make.
Alison, thanks very much.